In the Cold War, there was an era defined by terrifying apocalyptic tension. For 40 years, the greatest military empires in human history stood toe-to-toe, armed with enough nuclear weapons to turn the Earth's surface into a glowing parking lot. We are told stories of brilliant espionage, high-tech surveillance, and steely-eyed submarine captains playing a deadly game of underwater chess. We are led to believe that the military-industrial complex was a flawless, hyper-intelligent machine. But history is rarely a spy thriller. More often than not, history is a dark, absurd comedy written by bureaucrats who have absolutely no idea what they are doing. Welcome to the Acoustic Void. Today we are traveling to Sweden. We're going to look at a 15-year-long, multi-million-dollar military operation that brought a nation to the brink of war. The Swedish Navy deployed destroyers, helicopters, high-explosion depth chargers to hunt down a stealthy, elusive Soviet submarine fleet that was allegedly violating their territorial waters. The military was on high alert, the government was terrified, the sonar operations were sweating over their radar screens, listening to the sinister high-pitched clicking of Russian engineering. There was only one problem. It wasn't a Soviet submarine, it wasn't a secret weapon, it was quite literally the sound of thousands of fish collectively passing gas. In this video we are going to explore the most expensive, embarrassing and biologically hilarious intelligence failure in modern military history. We will look at how extreme geopolitical paranoia can cause highly decorated admirals to mistake a biological bodily function for a weapon of mass destruction. If you thought your government was wasting your tax dollars, wait until you see Swedish Navy dropping bombs on School of Flatulent Herring. Grab a gas mask and a sonar headset. It's going to get loud and it's going to get incredibly stupid. To understand how an entire modern military force could spend a decade and a half hunting down fish farts, you have to understand the psychological state of Sweden in the 1980s. Sweden was officially neutral during the Cold War, but geopolitically they were sitting in the worst possible neighborhood. They were sandwiched directly between the NATO alliance and the Soviet Union. The Baltic Sea was a claustrophobic, highly contested bathtub where Russian and Western warships constantly circled each other like angry sharks. The Swedes were naturally paranoid, but in October 1981 the paranoia was violently validated by an event known as Whiskey on the Rocks. On a foggy night, a Soviet Whiskey-class submarine, the S-363, was creeping through the Baltic Sea. Due to what the Soviets later claimed was a navigational error, which is military speak for captain probably being drunk and the compass being broken, the submarine drove straight into Swedish territorial waters. And it didn't just cross the line, it literally ran around on a jagged rock just 6 miles from a top-secret Swedish naval base. Imagine waking up, looking at the window and seeing a 250-foot-long Soviet nuclear submarine parked on your long beach, like a beached whale. It was the ultimate geopolitical oops moment. The standoff lasted for 10 days. Swedish coastal artillery locked their crosshairs on the sub, Soviet rescue ships lowered at the maritime border, and the world held its breath. Eventually the sub was towed back to the international waters, but the psychological damage to the Swedish military was permanent. The Swedish government realized that if a massive, clunky Soviet submarine could accidentally crash onto their shores without being detected by radar, their underwater defense grid was essentially made of Swiss cheese. The military brass went into a state of absolute hyper-vigilant hysteria. They became convinced that the waters around Stockholm were swarming with invisible Russian intruders. And then, right on cue, the Swedish hydrophones started picking up a sound. It wasn't a deep, rumbling hum of a massive nuclear reactor. It was a strange, high-pitched, repetitive clicking noise. It sounded like a frying bacon or someone running a stick along a picket fence. It was faint, it was rhythmic, and it was everywhere. The Swedish Navy didn't think, oh, the ocean is a noisy place. They thought, dear God, Soviets have invented a new undetectable micro-submarine and it's currently mapping out the entire coastline. The paranoia void had officially opened, and the Swedish military was about to dive in headfirst, armed to the teeth. When a military organization decides it has a problem, it doesn't look for the simplest solution, it looks for the most expensive one. Throughout the 1980s and into the 1990s, the Swedish Navy essentially declared war on the Baltic Sea. They funneled massive amounts of their defensive budget into a submarine warfare. They bought state-of-the-art hydrophone arrays. They deployed fleets of helicopters equipped with dipping sonars. They sent heavily armed corvettes to patrol the archipelagos day and night. Whenever the sonar operators heard that sinister high-pitched clicking, the military would scramble, sirens would wail, helicopters would launch, warships would race to the coordinates and aggressively drop high-explosive depth charges and anti-submarine mines into the freezing water, hoping to force the sneaky Russian midget submarines to the surface. But every time the water settled and the smoke cleared, there was nothing. No oil slicks, no debris, no angry Russian captains waving white flags, just dead silence and a few floating concussed fish. You have to appreciate the sheer cinematic comedy of this scenario. Picture a room full of highly decorated Swedish admirals, their chests covered in medals, standing around a glowing green radar screen in a secret underground bunker. They are sweating profusely, listening to a tape recording the repetitive tick, tick, tick sound. They are bringing in intelligence analysts, acoustic engineers and military strategists to decipher the code. They concluded that the Soviets had developed a fleet of miniature stealthy submersibles, perhaps manned by Spetsnaz commandos that used a revolutionary new propulsion system. They wrote classified reports detailing how this clicking was sound of advanced Russian cavitation technology, relentless invisible Soviet incursions. For 15 years, the Swedish Navy chased ghosts. They spent millions of kroner bombing the ocean. They nearly sparked international diplomatic incidents, constantly accusing the Kremlin of violating their sovereignty. The Russians, for their part, repeatedly denied having any secret midget submarines in Swedish waters. But of course, the Swedes just assumed the Russians were lying, because that's what Russians do apparently. The military was trapped in an echo chamber of its own funding. When you spend millions of dollars on submarine hunting equipment, you're going to find a submarine, even if you have to invent one out of thin air. The Acoustic Void had completely overridden their common sense. It never occurred to the greatest military minds of Scandinavia that terrifying sound of Soviet war machine was actually just sound of the local wildlife digesting its dinner. By 1996, the Cold War was over, the Soviet Union had collapsed, but the mysterious clicking sounds in the Swedish archipelagos had not stopped. In fact, they were getting louder. The Swedish military was facing a profound existential crisis. If the Soviet Union didn't exist anymore, who the hell was driving these midget submarines? Was it rogue Russian general? Was it the newly formed Russian Federation? Finally, after a decade and a half of dropping bombs on empty water, someone in the Swedish government had a radical, groundbreaking idea. Maybe we should ask a scientist. Enter Magnus Wahlberg and Håkan Westerberg, two civilian marine biologists. The military invited them into a highly classified top-secret naval facility. The admirals sat the biologists down, swore them to secrecy, and played the terrifyingly classified audio tapes of the Soviet intruders. Wahlberg put on the headphones, listened to the rhythmic, high-pitched frying bacon sounds, and frowned. He didn't hear the mechanical whir of a titanium propeller. He didn't hear the hum of a nuclear reactor. He heard bubbles. Wahlberg and Westerberg realized that the sound wasn't mechanical, it was biological. But what marine animal makes a sound like a ticking clock? To solve the greatest national security mystery of the 20th century, the scientists didn't use a supercomputer. They went to the local fish market, they bought a live Baltic herring, put it in a bucket of water and stuck a hydrophone in the bucket. What they discovered is a biological mechanism so absurd it feels like a prank, played by a god. Herring have a swim bladder that connects to their anal duct. When a school of herring gets frightened, say by a hungry seal or perhaps by a massive Swedish warship dropping depth charges on their heads, they communicate with each other by squeezing air out of their anal ducts. In the scientific community, this phenomenon was actually named fast repetitive tick. The acronym is FRT. Yes, the scientists literally named it a fart. When a single herring does it, it's a tiny microscopic click, but herring travel in a massive schools of tens of thousands, sometimes millions of fish. When a school of that size gets spooked, they all release gas at the exact same time. The collective, synchronized flatulence of a million terrified herring creates a massive high-frequency acoustic wave that sounds exactly like the clicking of a mechanical engine. The scientists had cracked the code. The terrifying, stealthy, unstoppable Soviet midget submarine fleet was a cloud of fish gas. Now just imagine being the guy who has delivered the PowerPoint presentation to the Swedish Military of Defense. You have to walk into a room full of 4-star admirals, men who have dedicated their entire careers to defending the realm, men who have authorized the expenditure of millions of dollars on high-explosive ordnance, and you have to look them in the eye and say, "Gentlemen, I have analyzed the acoustic signature of the enemy. The Red Menace is not a submarine, it's a biological gas leak. We have been carpet bombing fish farts for 15 years. The ego void in that room must have been dense enough to collapse into a black hole. This is the ultimate case study in cognitive bias. The Swedish military was so traumatized by the whiskey on the rocks incident that they lost the ability to process reality. When you are holding $1 billion anti-submarine hammer, every single sound in the ocean starts to look like a communist nail. They wanted to find a submarine so badly that their brains literally rewired the sound of aquatic digestion into a sound of Soviet propeller. The political fallout was a masterpiece of quiet bureaucratic humiliation. The Swedish government couldn't exactly hold a global press conference to announce that they had been outsmarted by a school of herring. They had spent years writing angry diplomatic letters to Moscow accusing the Russians of aggressive maritime incursions. Imagine the sheer confusion in the Kremlin during the 1980s. The Soviet Navy commander must have been sitting in Moscow, receiving furious diplomatic cables from Stockholm, thinking, "What the hell are the Swedes talking about? We don't even have a submarine that small. Are they hallucinating?" It turns out the only thing more dangerous than a hostile superpower is a military apparatus that refuses to admit it doesn't know what it's looking at. The Swedish Navy had essentially engaged in a 15-year-long, heavily armed, one-sided war against the Baltic Sea ecosystem. And the fish won. Once the military adjusted their sonar algorithms to filter out the specific frequency of the fast repetitive tick, the Soviet submarine incursions miraculously dropped to zero. The Phantom Fleet vanished overnight. You might listen to this story and laugh at the analog stupidity of the 1980s. You might think, well, that was Cold War. Today we have artificial intelligence, we have autonomous underwater drones, we have neural networks. A modern military would never make a mistake that stupid. Welcome to 2026 and welcome to the algorithmic void. If anything, the problem has gotten exponentially worse. The ocean is not a silent, sterile swimming pool. It's a chaotic, deafening, loud biological soup. Whales sing, shrimp snap their claws loud enough to shatter glass. Underwater volcanoes erupt and shifting ice shelves scream like grinding metal. Today, militaries are relying on AI-driven sonar systems to filter through this noise. But an AI is only as smart as the paranoid human who programmed it. If you feed the neural network a dataset based entirely on military threats, it is going to find a military threat. If a modern AI isn't programmed with a deep, multidisciplinary understanding of marine biology, it is entirely possible that an autonomous drone in the South China Sea could easily classify a squid mating call as a Chinese nuclear torpedo. We are handing the keys to our nuclear deterrence to an algorithms that don't know the difference between a cavitation bubble and biological bodily function. The Swedish hearing crisis is a hilarious historical footnote, but it's also a terrifying warning. It proves that the most sophisticated technology on the planet is completely useless if the people interpreting the data lack basic multidisciplinary curiosity. If the Swedish Navy had just hired one marine biologist in 1982, they would have saved millions of dollars and 15 years of national panic. Instead, they chose the arrogance of the uniform. They chose to believe that nature couldn't possibly be as loud, as weird, and as disruptive as human engineering. The story of the Swedish Navy and the flatulent herring is the ultimate deconstruction of military machismo. It strips away the sleek, terrifying veneer of a Cold War and reveals the absolute, bumbling absurdity underneath. We build these massive trillion-dollar defense networks to protect ourselves from each other, completely forgetting that we live on a wild biological planet that does not care about our geopolitical borders. The ocean does not care about NATO. The ocean does not care about Soviet Union. The ocean is just going to keep doing what it does, eating, swimming and passing gas in the dark. It is a comforting thought, in dark, cynical way. No matter how advanced our weapons get, no matter how much money we spend on a radar and sonar, human intelligence will always be vulnerable to the sheer chaotic comedy of nature. Next time you feel overwhelmed by the terrifying efficiency of the modern military-industrial complex, just close your eyes and picture a Swedish destroyer dropping a highly advanced depth charge into a frozen Baltic Sea, desperately trying to silence a fish. Stay strange, stay sharp, and if you hear a strange clicking in the dark, maybe just blame it on the dog. See ya.